Happy Independence Day, everybody. You may be going, wait a minute, DW, it's the day after Independence Day. Shut up, it's never too late to celebrate freedom! And in celebration of freedom, what we're taking a look at today is Broforce for PC, Mac, Linux, and PlayStation 4. This is an action platformer developed by Free Lives and published by Devolver Digital in October of 2015 for PC, Mac, and Linux, and it finally saw release on PlayStation 4 in March of this year. And it was rather well received when it came out, even though it did actually release in early access. And it's actually one of the early access success stories. There aren't all that many of those, unfortunately. But in this case, it actually went all the way to a full release that was feature complete and everything, and on top of that, it was very well received. And a lot of that does have to do with the fact that it's a love letter to action movies. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out whether it being a love letter to action movies is really all that it's got going for it, or if it's actually a solid game underneath that. Well, as far as presentation goes, it does have a pixel art aesthetic, which is well done. I mean, it's not particularly well detailed for the most part, apart from the sheer amount of devastation that tends to go on in the environments. There's a lot of destructible environments, there's a lot of blood and guts spraying everywhere. It's pretty ridiculous. But at the same time, it is yet another indie game that uses a pixel art aesthetic, although it does arguably work better in this than in most, because this is really designed more as a retro throwback in a lot more ways than simply, oh hey, it's a platformer. And the fact that there are so many nice touches with the visuals, as well as the fact that there's just so much carnage going on, does give it quite a bit of charm. Speaking of charm, there's the sound design, where actually a lot of the weapons have some pretty nice oomph to them, which is really well appreciated and actually surprising given that it's an indie game. Explosions sound surprisingly good for this sort of thing, and when you get down to the voice acting, it's suitably corny as hell, even though there certainly isn't very much of it. And then of course there's the music, which is this sort of action movie soundtrack that works extremely well for the game. It's certainly fast-paced enough, and you end up actually finding that it gets you in the mood for the carnage pretty well. So overall, despite some fatigue with the pixel art aesthetic that they use, the presentation actually ends up being really solid all around. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, except that this game basically has no story to it whatsoever. You play as various members of the Broforce, an elite, super badass fighting team that has one purpose and one purpose only: to kick the living crap out of the bad guys. And that is exactly what you do in this game. You go from third world nation to third world nation, and you wreak havoc on everything you come across. And by doing this, you are spreading freedom everywhere you go, utilizing such wonderfully proven methods as guns and knives and various explosives and biceps, especially the biceps. But along the way, you're also running across various prisoners of war, and you rescue them, and as you keep rescuing them, you unlock more bros to run around with, all of whom are parodies of various action movie heroes. You start with Rambro and the Bromando, for example. You can also unlock characters like the Brominator, or Indiana Brones, or if you're more for the female persuasion of action heroes, you can unlock Ellen Ripbro, or Cherry Broling, or the Broad. See, Free Lives understand one simple fact: you don't have to have testicles to be a bro. It's all about having the right attitude and being a total badass, and let's face it, these various heroes are exactly that. Now all that said, this does mean that the game has one significant problem. If you don't find that sort of thing amusing, then you're not going to get a damn thing out of this game. This is definitely something that only people who are really into action movies are going to get the most out of, because most of the references are going to be completely lost on everybody else. And while the completely over-exaggerated sense of America, fuck yeah, that it gives you is obviously meant to be ridiculous and not taken at all seriously, there are actually people out there in, well, basically anywhere that's not the US, that actually think all Americans think that way. It's actually a very, very small minority of people who really believe that sort of thing, which is why something like this is so funny to us. And the weird part about this game is, it's not even made by Americans. It's made by South Africans. But the thing is, they get it. They understand that that mentality is just something to be made fun of, and they roll with it. The end result is a game that has plenty of charm and is pretty funny to boot, so they did a very good job with that. What they did less of a good job with are the actual gameplay mechanics. And what I mean by that is that there are very specific things that this game does that don't really work out all that well. While destructible environments are definitely a nice touch, and they do add some tactical elements to the gameplay, whether you want to destroy the environment to take out a bunch of enemies, or whether you're just actually getting the environment blown up in your face and you're having to compensate for it, more often than not it actually ends up getting in your way. This is especially true once you get later on in the game and they start throwing artillery at you, which deforms a large part of the environment without you having any real say in it. Next up, you die in one hit. While this does make the game a bit more difficult, it does also result in a lot of fairly cheap deaths. Next up, you have a lives system, and the way the lives system works is that you have your one bro that you're playing, and that's considered a life. And if you have any remaining lives, then if that bro dies, then you respawn at the last checkpoint with a different bro, and it's a randomly generated one, so you're not sure if you're going to have, say, Ram Bro, or if the next one's going to be, say, the Brominator, or Bromando, or any number of the other ones, because it's fairly random which one you're going to actually get, and some bros are better at certain things than others. They do each have different stats, different weapons, different special abilities that they can bring to the table, and that does mean that you're going to need to learn the ins and outs of every single one. It's especially annoying when you end up with a bro that is really not suited to the situation you're running into, where, for example, if you're running into a lot of enemies that are better at longer ranges, then having a guy with a shotgun isn't really going to help you out much. And that, combined with the whole you die in one hit thing, means that a lot of those cheap deaths can get incredibly irritating if you're given a bro that is not really helpful to you in this situation, and you end up just dying over and over and over again, having to thus restart the level over and over and over again. Because that's what happens if you lose all your lives. Luckily, you can replenish lives by finding the various prisoners of war scattered all over the place. Now, not only do they unlock bros given a certain threshold if you rescue enough of them, but every single time that you actually rescue a prisoner of war, it changes which bro you're playing, and that can actually get kind of annoying sometimes. Because you don't have a say in it, it just randomly chooses a bro for you to play as now, and if it's an instance where you just unlocked a new bro, then you'll be playing that one, but if it's an instance where you haven't unlocked a bro in a while and you're still not due to unlock one, then it's just going to be one of the random ones that you've unlocked already. Next up, the Covert Missions, which require you to do things in a very specific way on one life. Now, while you do get a reward at the end, they're just irritating to go through, particularly if they require you to do certain things, like the Agility one, which requires you to use the flip jump, which I still haven't quite figured out because the game does a pretty bad job of explaining how it works. You don't really get any tooltips while you're playing, you're just kind of expected to figure out everything on your own, which is fine, I'd rather not be patronized to, but certain more advanced maneuvers I would actually like to know how to do, please. To give you a prime example, did you know you can throw enemy grenades right back at them? Maybe, maybe not, but the game doesn't tell you. Or how about the fact that if you're using a sword, then you can actually reflect bullets back at enemies? Yeah, I figured that out the hard way. And while it's fun to learn things that way, when it comes to things like, say, the flip jump, then I would definitely like to know how they're done so I can actually replicate it instead of it just happening at random. Now at this point, I'm sure you're probably throwing around the, oh, DW sucks at the game. Yeah, I do. I'm terrible at this game. I'm terrible at a lot of platformers. It's never been my genre. Doesn't mean I don't enjoy playing them. Doesn't make what I'm saying any less valid either. It's a good thing then that the actual gameplay mechanics are pretty straightforward. You just have your movement and you have a shoot button, a melee button, and a special weapon button. The special weapon requires ammunition, which you'll find ammo crates scattered throughout the levels if you've unlocked them anyway, which is really easy to do anyway. But these special weapons can be anything from just simply throwing a grenade in the case of Rambro to shooting out a special bunch of missiles as Bromando, or having that targeting thing that RoboCop does. Every single character has their own specific special weapon, and most of them are pretty devastating. Some of them not quite as much, they're a little harder to get the hang of, like Mr. Anderbro, who has the ability to basically absorb various projectiles and launch them right back at enemies. And of course, each character has their own specific weapons as well, so they're not simply having different special weapons, they have different primary weapons. Some of them, for example, Indiana Brones, have melee weapons. In his case, he has a whip. But in the case of, say, Braid, he has a sword, so you can just go to town on enemies. But in Indiana Brones' case, his special weapon is his revolver. revolver, which is ridiculously powerful. So they reverse it a bit. Now the melee weapon is usually a knife, sometimes it's just a simple punch or kick or something like that, but usually it's a knife, and it's a pretty quick kill if you can hammer the button fast enough. Most enemies will die in one hit as well, although there are some, for example the chain gunners or the various mechs that you'll run into that require quite a bit more punishment to actually go down. But generally speaking, you're going to be slaughtering a lot of bad guys really quickly. When you're not doing that, you're traversing the environment, which means running around, jumping on things, using zip lines, using the various tanks that you'll run into scattered around the levels that you can actually shoot and then jump on them, so you'll be going forward at a pretty high speed until you have to jump off because it'll blow up in your face. You can destroy bits of the environment to cause ceilings to collapse or floors to collapse out from underneath the various enemies, and they'll fall to their doom or they'll get crushed, and all sorts of various ways you can just utterly eviscerate your foes. And that part of the game is actually pretty damn fun. You end up with a lot of carnage really quickly, and the game is definitely making sure that you feel every bit of it because it's constantly shaking the screen every time something happens. There's lots of blood and guts and pixels flying all over the place. It's pretty glorious. And things can get even wackier when you get 4-player co-op going, because imagine the game as ridiculous as it is with 1 player, only now there's 4 and they can actually hurt each other. It's like playing Battletoads all over again, except with a lot more guns and explosions and blood and guts. And definitely way more freedom. But there is one thing that has absolutely plagued this game since launch. Bugs and glitches. They are all over the place, and you've definitely seen at least one in this video so far. Namely the fact that I hit a tank and then jumped on top of it only to have it rocket me toward the actual start of the level, even though it wasn't supposed to do that. And that's one of the more benign bugs. Sometimes there's a bit more game-breaking stuff, particularly in the realm of crashes. You will see that on occasion, but I actually didn't run into any. It's definitely one of the more commonly reported issues, though, as are some control issues that apparently were in there since the beginning, although I've never really had much of a problem with the controls. Some people are reporting that there's input lag, and particularly when you go into co-op mode, the more players you got, the worse it gets, so that could be an issue with netcode more than anything else. In fact, it seems the netcode in this game is kind of spotty because the actual co-op, even though it's a cool idea and it's kind of ridiculously silly, ends up having some issues with connections. So you might try to get into a game and it may not work, or you might be in a game and it might just be really laggy. Things like that. Now this does mean that one of the big draws of the game, the 4-player co-op, can be a bit of a mess at times. You're going to have to put up with a fair amount of glitches with it, and you might have to put up with some connection problems. But when it works, the game is actually quite a bit of fun, despite its problems. The amount of charm the game has really ends up outweighing its problems, and it ends up becoming a lot more fun than it really has any right to be. If it didn't have the bro aesthetic going on, it would just be a fairly solid action platform with some kind of cool elements in it, but that elevates it a bit beyond that, and it becomes something that I can actually pretty easily recommend, at least as long as you find that sort of sense of humor funny. As I said, if you don't get anything out of action movies or making fun of America, then you probably won't get much of anything out of Broforce. But if you can get something out of those, then you might actually end up enjoying this quite a lot. Ultimately, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. It's a good game that doesn't take itself at all seriously, and despite its problems ends up being quite a lot of fun. It's just a shame that it has those problems in the first place. If they could get those ironed out, that would be very beneficial to it in the long run, but I don't really see that happening too much. I hope you enjoyed the holiday, and thanks for watching.